So what I'm going to share with you is the fruits of work for the last 7 months. And I presented it yesterday for the first time in the Science of Consciousness conference in Taormina, a shorter version of what I'm going to share. And I hope you're going to enjoy that. I'm going to discuss some of the physics, but if there are any questions about the fundamental element of the physics, I prefer Jack is going to answer them, because the focus of this presentation is going to be the work that I've done past it to try and integrate it into a broader picture that I hope proposes a solution to the hard problem, which is the current holy grail of consciousness science. So let's start, if you don't mind. So what we're going to have here, we're going to basically cover three things. We're going to show, first of all, that consciousness has quantum characteristics. The second thing in the program is that I'm going to use a theory and show that, in my view, consciousness is the same all across the animal kingdom, which is a surprising result, and it was surprising for me also, and I'll explain how I derived it. And the last element is I'm going to present an attempt to prove that what we call phenomenal consciousness, which means our experience, actually stems a lot from retrocausality, and I'm proposing an evolutionary mechanism which is going to show how it emerged. And by doing that, we're solving part of what we call the hard problem, which we're going to address. So don't worry if you don't know exactly what it is. So let's start. And before we start, I'm going to share with you a little story. About 6 months ago, I was living in Paris, and we had a friend who was a real French raconteur. He liked good wines. He had a wine shop, and he liked good cheese. And one day he came and he showed us how to make scallops. I never had scallops that way before, where you basically open them up, you serrate them, and you put some lemon. For those who like it, it's delicious. So myself and my partner, that Jack has met, decided the next day, let's try it ourselves. So we went to the market and we bought some scallops and we brought them to the kitchen. And I didn't realize that the scallops are alive. So I kind of was trying to open it and shuck it. And as I was doing it, I could feel the scallop kind of resisting. It didn't want me to open, because obviously if I'm going to open it all the way, it's going to die. And I felt a strange feeling in my stomach. I had this kind of voice in my head, oh my God, the scallop is conscious. I can't kill it. And I must say, I chickened out and asked my partner to do it. And in a sense, this presentation, what it's going to answer indirectly, I'll come back to the end, is the scallop conscious? And hopefully I'll share my conclusion at the end, and you can decide if you agree with me or not. So let's, first of all, provide a bit of background to what we're seeing here. First of all, I'm going to provide a few slides about the background of consciousness, because not everyone on this call are in the field. So the main question around consciousness is what causes phenomenological consciousness, which means, why do we experience anything at all? Why do we need experience? If I see a red apple, where does the red come from? Do I need to see it? And the definition which is used in the field, which I don't really like very much, but this is the standard in the field, was coined in 1974 by a British philosopher called Nagel, which says that an organism is conscious only if there's something to feel like it being that organism. And it's part of this essay called "What is it like to be a bat?" And the idea is that something is conscious if there's an experience which is like to be that organism. And that is the standard definition. And that's a difficult definition because I don't think it's well defined, no pun intended. And so there's a different ways to try and explain this problem. The most famous way was coined by a philosopher called David Chalmers in 1995. And it says, why do we need to experience anything? Why can't we have like a zombie that has the same wiring in our brain as we do and does everything we do, but just doesn't experience anything? What is the role of experience in our daily life, and why did it arise? And that's known as the hard problem. The easy problem of consciousness is what most people that are in the field look at, is what are the neural correlates of consciousness? So there's a lot of work about trying to measure activity in the brain. For example, a few weeks ago, I read that a machine was developed in Japan that you put some form of electrodes on the head, and you show the subject's pictures, and without any training, it can actually recover very high resolution of those pictures. So, and being able to do that is known as the easy problem, because you're kind of showing, well, I found a neural correlate of what's going on in the brain, but I haven't really proven why that causes the experience of consciousness. So there's this gap, and they call it the quality awareness gap. And saying when we're aware of something, we see qualities like the redness of the apple, but there's no way that we can actually take up all of those little qualities like the redness of the apple, the blueness of the sea, and somehow sum them up into our experience of the world. There's no way for us to construct it easily, and there's this gap about how does this happen? I don't want to go too much into that because it takes too much time, but this is the setting of the problem we're trying to resolve. And there's quite a few physical theories that try to address this issue. There's what's known as the top-down approaches and the bottom-up approaches. And the name basically gives them away. The top-down approaches try and understand what can create consciousness from understanding the mechanisms of consciousness, how we think, what do we know about different parts of the brain and how they work together. I'm listing a few of them on the left. Specifically, if you look, I'm calling them physicalist theories. These are theories that believe that consciousness arises in the brain from physical interactions without any other elements which are not measurable. So the most famous ones are this global workspace theory, which says that there's like this central point where there's lots of different areas in the brain and all work together. And one of them has prominence from time to time, and it actually fills the workspace, and that's what we're conscious of. One of the most popular consciousness theories at the moment is called integrated information theory by a neurologist called Tononi in Italy. And this one basically says the brain is very complicated, and we can see that a lot of the elements in it are holistic. So we're going to create a network of all the different elements, and we're going to see that some of those elements are irreducible. And he says those irreducible elements are called consciousness. And he says we can measure them using a number. He doesn't say why they're called consciousness. And I think he's saying it's mumbo jumbo, but it's very popular. And it's an attempt to reverse engineer what consciousness is from qualities of consciousness. And the important one is the one at the bottom on the left, because I'm going to use it as a model for something I'm going to share with you later. The bottom-up theories include quantum theories, which try to explain what is happening at the lowest level in the brain. There's a new theory that's undeveloped, an Israeli physicist, that says you can use special relativity and general relativity to explain consciousness, but I also think it's a bit of hand-waving. And then there's neural computation theories that says we want to try and build neural networks that are more and more complex and see if we can come up with something that resembles consciousness, etc. None of those theories by itself provides a complete solution. Some of them seem to work better than others. And so coming back closer to our topic here, the second area of background I want to discuss is the quantum element. Before I'm going to go into Jack's work, I'm just going to mention the currently existing most popular quantum theory, which is called orchestrated objective reduction. And that's a theory that was developed by Roger Penrose. In 1989, he published a book called Emperor's New Mind. It's a great book. And then he followed it up with another book in 1994. And basically, he came up with this idea that he thinks that because of mathematical thought and the way that people solve problems, the brain is not computable, which means that you can't solve certain problems if the brain was like a computer, and we do solve them as individuals. Therefore, you can't use traditional descriptions of information systems to describe what's going on in the brain. And that was his starting point. And he developed this theory, which I think is very elegant, but I don't think is right, where he says, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the left, you'll have a system, you'll have a particle, and the particle is going to split into two superpositions, for example, and both of them are going to occur simultaneously as part of a mixed state of quantum physics. And eventually, they're going to start to grow apart in space. Now he says, because those molecules are going to have a mass, a weight, they're going to influence space-time, and that influence is going to create some kind of a gravity potential, and that eventually is going to collapse those two superpositions into a single state. And he even gives a formula on the right to more or less say the amount of time the collapse will take is a function of the gravitational energy of the system. The claim that Penrose made was that that act of gravitational collapse, which he's the first person that kind of came up with, is the consciousness as we feel it. Again, it's not a proven, or it's nothing that actually shows us the case. His intuition is that he says this collapse is an uncomputable event, and therefore it can lead to consciousness. And then Hameroff is the one that introduced the ideas of microtubules that Maurice mentioned earlier, which I'll very briefly touch on. And he contacted Penrose after he read his book, and he says, I've got a candidate for where in the brain we think this might happen. Microtubules, for those who don't know, are, in a sense, the scaffolding of the brain and of the neurons. These are very, very long, if you want to look at them like channels that are made up of a protein called a tubulin. And you can see in this example in the middle, they sit inside the neural pathway. They've got water in them, and the water can conduct polarity, they conduct electricity. And those pictures that you see on the right, those black and white patterns, are the different monomers of this tubulin. And it creates patterns that basically go up and down, and measurements in the last 5 years, which Maurice mentioned, shows that they got a variety of resonant frequencies that occur at different levels, up to the terahertz levels. And a lot of people believe, in some cases, those resonance frequencies show collective effect that can go over time. And Penrose is the one that initially mentioned Fourier condensation as a possible mechanism for long-term coherence in a living environment. So this is currently the most viable, not viable, but the most popular theory of quantum consciousness. Penrose is going to talk here on Saturday, and what he's going to introduce, which I was quite pleased to hear that because I wasn't aware when I actually prepared this material, that in order to resolve some of the problems around his collapse of the gravitational induced collapse, you have to introduce retrocausal calculations to remove dissipation and heat from the equations. So he actually believes now that you need retrocausality to create self-consistency in his own theory, but for other reasons. And so we're going back to the bit of work I did with Jack around 6-7 years ago. We met in London, my common friend, and we met a few times in London. We actually had a very nice supper with Hal Partnoff and Kit Green, which I'm going to mention later. And we also met last year in San Francisco. And the work that Jack did a few years ago was around developing some ideas around PQM and then applying them to the idea of consciousness. And I'm going to be using some of those insights in this talk. And some of them, to be honest, I only understood recently about one or two of them, and I think they make amazing sense and they're very elegant, and I'll mention them when I get to it. And so PQM is a name given by Sarfatti to a few insights that are provided. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to stop minimize. Oh, don't worry. Okay. So I'm not going to go to all the details, but the idea is that through the work of people like Roderick Sutherland and other people, it's become possible to describe a Lagrangian of a system which is quantum in nature, using Bohm's pilot wave theory and using Aronov's two-state vector formalism. Now, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with it. I didn't really go into any details in it, but essentially the two-state vector formalism says that the present is a mix of quantum wave from the past and what Jack likes to call a destiny wave from the future. So the present is actually a mix of future and past wave functions that mix together. I think it's a beautiful theory because it reduces a lot of the problems that we have in quantum mechanics today. And in a sense, you end up having to make two choices. You either give up locality or you give up the direction of time. And both of them lead to consistent theories. Current quantum physics gives up locality. Using the two-state formalism, we accept waves coming from the future, but then we don't have any non-local effects of suddenly impacting a proton 10 light years away. And I think this is really a much more elegant way to look at it. But coming back to where we are, so Sutherland showed that you can take a system and you can combine this Bohm pilot wave theory, which deals with real particles in a relativistic framework, with this two-state vector formalism. And then he did something else. He showed that you can also include what's known as bibbles. Bibbles, again, is a term that I've learned through talking to Jack. Is a term developed by Bell from the Bell inequality in, I think, 1970, where it's the kind of the part of a system which behave in a classical way, i.e. they're not quantum. And all this mishmash together means that you can put together a classical system, like a nerve, and a quantum system, like a wave, and treat them together in a self-consistent way. And it deals with a lot of issues, and I haven't really seen anyone do that. So I think the principle that this can be done opens up a lot of possibilities in understanding how real-world physics work. The second thing that Jack introduced, which I really think was great, is this idea that if we look at gravity, and you know, we all sometimes, when you go to the planetarium, those of us who still remember going to a planetarium, you sometimes see those very nice funnels that you can take a coin and it goes around and around and around and comes down because it imitates what a gravity wave looks like. Einstein's action-reaction organizing principle is around the fact that when you have a body that has a mass, it impacts the space around it, and is also impacted by all the bodies that they have their own mass. So essentially, it's both impacting the world and it's impacted by the world. And what Jack was saying, you know, in quantum physics, mostly when we have a wave function, it impacts the world, but we don't really take into account the kind of back reaction that would have back on that body. And that doing that adds an extra level, which introduces something that I'm going to mention now, which is quite exciting in the context of what we're talking about. Now, Jack, by the way, if you feel that you want to jump on the physics side, feel free, but if you want, you can also do it at the end. I'm not really going to run into the equation. The idea, though, is that in general, unitarity of the system means that what we call the pilot wave is the information wave that drives the particles and gives them access to the information about quantum interactions. And it has to be conserved in order for the system to behave in a certain way. And if you include those back reaction, it kind of breaks that unitarity principle, which what it does, it leads to those three outcomes at the bottom. Those outcomes is really what's important for anyone to remember from this section. The first outcome is that the quantum system with bibbles, which means with classical elements, can be described using the past and the future. It may lead to the breaking of a Born rule. And that is important because under certain conditions, if that happens, it leads to something called entanglement signaling. And in our context, it means that it's possible to send information using those waves coming from the future, if that is something that the system can occur. And this is something new that came from the work that Jack did. And this is really, I think, the key for what I'm going to present later. And so Jack had this insight. He says, you know, this information wave, which is been kind of derived by Bohm, reminds me a bit of the kind of information that you can have when it comes to consciousness and how consciousness can impact a living organism. And the back reaction changes that information wave. So the insight that Jack had is, well, this back reaction, this effect of the field on itself, on the particle, is really what causes consciousness, or let's say causes life that leads to consciousness. And that is a completely new idea. I've changed it a bit in the end. Forgive me, Jack, but we can discuss it later. And so let's kind of talk about how can you look at a quantum system and say, this is something that's going to help me describe consciousness. What you see here is a diagram that shows you the scale of the human central nervous system. So here it starts with molecules, so it's already a high-level system compared to atomic, subatomic particles. And you can see that when you get to neurons, you're already many, many degrees of order of magnitude higher than traditional quantum effects. And when you go up to systems or the whole nervous system, it's a very, very, very high level, very complex system. And closing that gap is very challenging. And I think this is a lot of the challenge of a lot of those quantum type theories, because people have ideas about how things can happen, but there's no real proposals of how to do that. And really what it means is that quantum theories happen to operate at a very, very low level, and they don't seem to kind of meld into any of those what are called top-down theories that try to describe the operation of consciousness as in a larger kind of a way. And you need to integrate those levels to be able to provide a full theory. And I'm going to attempt to do that in this presentation. So let's go to the first, and actually the easiest and shortest part of this program, the assertion that consciousness has quantum characteristics. And I'm going to use two arguments to show that. The first argument is based on an article that was published in 1979 by Benjamin Libet. Benjamin Libet became very famous because he's the first one that did the experiment that showed that if someone wants to do something, let's say move their hand to pick up a glass, the nerve signal is identified in the brain by about a second before the actual person is aware of their intention, and led to a lot of issues around the issue of free will. These specific experiments have a lot of other explanations now, but the experiment we're going to discuss now is a bit different. What Libet did, he says, let me try and think what happens when I touch someone in the hand or when I use an electrode to excite their brain. And what he did, he had patients that for medical reasons, or epilepsy mostly, had to have electrodes in their brain. So what he did, he says, okay, I've got a system of measuring when someone says they're conscious. So what you see here on the top picture, the one that says A, he has an apparatus that touches the person on their hand. And when he touches the person on their hand, straight away the person says, oh, I feel something. So there's hardly any gap. I think the gap is 30 milliseconds. And then he goes to the place in the brain that actually processes the signal that comes from the hand, and he starts an electrode to stimulate it. And he says that up to about half a second, nothing happens. And only half a second where you can see this potential slowly building up, he calls it neural adequacy, only then the person says, oh, I feel something. So when you touch physically, you feel it straight away. When you use a brain electrode, it takes half a second. Okay, that by itself is fine. But what happened is, and this is what happened in section D, is something really weird. What happened in section D is that the automatic apparatus touches the hand of the person, and after 200 milliseconds, which means less than the 500 milliseconds, it starts to stimulate the brain. And when that happens, the person, even though you touched him before, doesn't report that he felt the touching. It only reports it after half a second. So let's try and think about it. If nothing happens in the brain and I touch your hand, you feel it straight away. But if 200 millimeters after that start to stimulate the area, I don't report the touch that happened 200 milliseconds before. It's as if the effect, the interference in the brain gets transmitted backwards in time and informs the system that nothing happened. And only after half a second, you feel the touch. And this is very similar to a delay choice experiment, which we know in quantum physics. And this is already published in 1979. People replicated it, and no one's ever shown that it doesn't work. And I'm not aware of any mechanism in nature besides retrocausality in quantum physics that can explain this kind of behavior. So that's the first clue, in my view, that consciousness has a quantum element in it. The second element is something that a lot of people are really familiar with. I have three areas in the slide. The first one is the huge amount of precognition experiments that were done. I saw a talk, by the way, Jack, with Daniel Sheehan yesterday, and he talked about a new kind of precognition experiment, which blew my mind. I don't know if anyone, if you ever heard of it. It's called a tripartite precognition experiment. So think about it. Newspapers publish pictures in the sections on a daily basis. So a lot of newspapers publish a daily picture from AP that describes somewhere in the world. So what they did is they took a person and said, in a day or two, this paper is going to publish a picture. I want you to draw what you think this picture is going to be. And they seal the picture. And then the picture comes out, and you can see that this drawing is very similar to that picture. The reason why it's a triple blind experiment is because the picture that is in the paper has not yet been taken. It's only been taken the next day because these are daily pictures. So it removes this idea that maybe someone has that knowledge and somehow you can communicate to it. It's truly an event that happened in the future. Now, I'm not going to go into more details, but there's a list here of at least 3 articles. One of them is with Julia Mossbridge, where they actually collated, done a meta-analysis of a lot of precognition experiments. And I think anyone who reads the literature and is intellectually honest can't ignore the fact that it works. The bottom line is something that obviously Jack is very familiar with, is his work and other people's work with the Stargate program and the remote viewing issues. And anyone who's read those accounts also, I think, has to be intellectually dishonest not to accept that remote viewing is a real possibility and you need some other mechanism in the world to explain it. The third element, personal experience. I'm not going to go into it, but I personally was exposed quite a few times in my life to events where other feeling from a distance or very clear predictions of the future. So all of those all those non-local and non-temporal events cannot be explained unless you have some sort of quantum mechanical underlyings. And I think all of those things together, what I call curated evidence, supports that consciousness occurs, and it possibly has a local retrocausal nature because of those experiments. And only quantum theory can currently support these. I just want to make a quick comment. I personally don't think that non-computability is a strong enough reason to go quantum. And the reason is that we know in science that when you look at, let's say, a problem and you run out of ideas, a lot of the time you can look at something completely different and use allegories, analogies, or other things to kind of take ideas across from one field to another. And it's a separate process than trying to solve a non-computable problem from a Gödel's perspective. But I'm not going to go into that now. But I think that all those other things together at least convinces me that consciousness is a quantum element, which is very strong. The second thing we're going to now discuss is how do we marry quantum physics, a quantum consciousness, to a top-down theory. And to do that, I'm going to present a top-down theory, which I think is a good candidate to be connected to a quantum underpinning. And I'll explain why it's a good candidate. The theory is called predictive forecasting. And actually, part of it is going to answer one of the issues that Maurice Passman raised earlier about the driving of the car and suddenly seeing the red light or something changes. So, and the goal of this section my goal was, how do I identify a model of consciousness that could be a candidate for quantum integration? And I first came upon this by a really excellent book called The Hidden Spring by a psychoanalyst, neurologist called Mark Solms, and I suggest everyone who's interested should read it. But the idea behind this theory is that the way the brain works is the brain doesn't actually have a model of the world. The brain continuously creates predictions about the world. So we have initial sensory information coming in, and we start to use the memory, and we start to build lots of models. And those models try to fit the world to our experience and what we think. It was first developed by a guy called Friston. Anyone who's interested, he came up with used this beautiful concept called a Markov blanket, which shows how a collection of cells can actually start to have a memory and models of the world. But the idea here is that what we do is based on prediction and inference, and there's hierarchical processing of the brain in the brain. And from a physics point of view, the point of an organism and the point of consciousness is to minimize free energy. And the way it does it is by trying to reduce the prediction error of the system. And it's a bit much, but as I talk, you'll see what I mean. And this Solms took it forward and he identified the location of consciousness in the brain. And this is why I like this theory and why I think this theory is a great candidate for integration with quantum physics. So Solms, what he did is he said, there's a certain, this system, you see this line here, it's called the reticular activating system. And this is a part of the brain that sits in the middle, and it's connected to two systems. It's connected to the autonomic system, which gets all the information from the body, but it also has all the information from the cerebellum that comes down and meets here. And what experimentally was shown that there's an area of a few cubic millimeters in that thing that if you interfere with that area, consciousness is lost immediately. And also psychotropic drugs affect that specific area. So a lot of the drugs we use as mood stabilizers or for other disorders actually affect there, and they seem to have a very strong impact. And his view was that consciousness comes from affect, from feeling, that this is what allows us to feel our way through. And the reason for that is that, and I'm going to come to Maurice's example, let's assume you're driving your car and you see people slowing, you slow down, everything looks the same, and then suddenly something comes on the right. Up to this point, you didn't need to change your model of the world. Everything that's been happening has been happening like it's been happening to you millions of times when you drove a car and you slow down at a traffic light. The minute something comes in, your model of the world doesn't work anymore the way that it used to work. You have a prediction error. Your initial model of I'm slowing down to a traffic light and everything is fine is no longer accurate. So consciousness is what comes in to actually allow you to fix your prediction error, to say, okay, well, what's going on? I need a new model. Oh, this is car coming, is it going to hit me? Whatever. And that improvement of prediction, according to that theory, is consciousness on a high level. And I think it's a beautiful theory because I think you can fit it to a lot of experience that we have as human beings. And this is a known picture, it's known as the triune brain. And it says the brain essentially is what's the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and then above it is the primate brain, which is most of our gray matter sits. And that area that we're talking about, which Solm believes this is the little pocket of gray cells, which is consciousness, sits here in the reptilian brain. It is part of evolution from the beginning. And so to give it a high level picture, we have your consciousness sits here in the middle, and it sits between two systems. We have the autonomic input system, and the reason why it works is that when you walk around and something happens and it's urgent, you need to react before you think. And so, for example, if you walk and suddenly something goes into your visual system, your system is going to actually start to turn your body automatically before you're even aware of it towards wherever the threat is coming from. But we still have to make sense of what it is. And making sense is what happens in our cortical input, where we actually analyze the world, we see what it is that's coming, and then we can respond appropriately. So consciousness kind of sits in the middle between this very quick autonomic or instinctive responses and those, if you want to call it qualia or thought out responses that give us context, that kind of top of the model that I mentioned. And this kind of made me think, you remember the beginning of my story is like, are scallops conscious? I'm kind of thinking, what makes human consciousness special? And one of the things that came to my mind is, how much information do we have in consciousness? Because we take it for granted. We look in the world, we see quite a complex picture around us, but our picture is a picture that we build. We don't see everything at once. So I was asking the question, how much information is there actually in our conscious focus? And I did some research. There isn't that much written about it, but the things that are written about it are quite surprising. So the human temporal resolution, which means if things change around us, how much information can we absorb, is 60 different bits of information per second. And if you think about it, for such a complex system as the brain, it seems quite low. In terms of traditional psychology, the psychologists say we can have 4 chunks in memory. And in terms of a lot of other research that was done, depending on the context, we can hold between 3 to 100 bits of information at any given time. And from a visual point of view, we need about 11, 12 bits of information to create a picture that's meaningful. Now, if you think about it, this is a really, really small amount of information. And the motivation for me for looking at it is, if we can build a quantum system that can model a consciousness, we want it to have as fewer components as possible. Otherwise, it's too complicated. And in this case, I found it very positive, because if consciousness is such a small amount of information content, it's going to be less difficult to build a quantum system that actually mimics it, because the number of free variables is very low. The conclusion that I got from that is that because the information content of our consciousness is very low, it can't really be a good candidate for differentiating between humans and animals. Because, if we only have 3 to 100 bits of information and 11 significant bits, how low can it get for a mouse or a rabbit or a cow or whatever? So I was trying to think, what does that mean? And I just want to make a distinction between the content of experience, of conscious experience, and the information content of experience. And I'll explain what I mean. Information content of experience is how many bits I can see it every second. The content of experience is everything that kind of gets built together, which is obviously much more than that. And that leads me to what I call my radar analogy to consciousness. So you see on the left, this is like a radar. And the way radar works is got this very narrow beam that scans the area. And whenever it hits something, it kind of creates a picture. And so our consciousness, in my view, looking at those approaches, is like this narrow beam with a very small window of information. And it scans. What does it scan? It scans the input that comes from our brain. And so it basically gets all the input in our brain, and it builds a picture of reality which is rich. But the actual door through which this picture is built is very, very narrow. And all organisms share this structure. This structure that I showed you with the two pyramids can be shared by all organisms, because all organisms have this autonomic system. And all organisms above a certain complexity have the cortical system, the brain. And the best way to think about it is, this is a dumb computer terminal. I'm calling it phi because this is consciousness. On the left, we have a bat. A bat have got about 5 million of what's known as sensory associative neurons. These are the neurons that sit on the top of the head and actually gives you intelligence. Humans have about 20 billion. And so, but you can have a dumb terminal, and it can be connected to an abacus, or it can be connected to a supercomputer. You're still going to see the information to a dumb terminal. Here, you're just going to see it fast, and you're going to see more of it. And I think this is the model of consciousness. And so the last part, I'm going to show how this arises from retrocausality, and I'm going to propose an evolutionary mechanism that explains why we're conscious, why it happens in the first place. So I modified Jack's idea slightly, and I'll explain in the details why I think it works. I think that retrocausality is the primitive of consciousness. So the back reaction, I think, allows for the information to flow, but the actual primitive here is the retrocausality. And I think it seems crucial because it allows us to integrate the senses, and I'll explain why. And it also provides an evolutionary advantage. And this diagram essentially shows the whole picture, and I'll go step by step. So let's assume first we have a sensory input. It's step one. It comes into the system. So what normally would happen is that because our brain is very complicated, they have to compile a lot of information from lots of sources, and they have to make sense of them. And that takes time. This is the 500 milliseconds that Libet kind of call neural adequacy. And this is the time it takes to take the information and process it and create an internal model of that, which is the qualia, what we feel. This is the redness of the apple. And when that model is built, and this is going up, if you remember, I showed you this pyramid of models that gets built according to this theory. When you get to the point where you have to make a choice to improve the prediction, that choice is a wave collapse event, which happens here at point 3. And the difference between that and Orch or Penrose's theory, Penrose says the wave collapse is consciousness. This is, I think, really, Jack, was a great idea that you had, is kind of realize this is what you meant. I only realized it recently, that what happens then is there's a retrocausal event that goes back 500 milliseconds to where the conscious event happens, which what we saw in the picture, that the person feels it. Now, Jack had this intuition that I didn't understand until recently, that consciousness and that weak measurements are an important part of the process. And I kind of didn't really understand why weak measurements. And then I got it. And the reason is that the wave collapse happens here. This is where the information is. But if consciousness would also happen here, then we're not going to have this effect or retrocausality that will allow us to do this. And if the wave collapse happens here and the information goes back, this is where the weak measurement occurs. Weak measurements, for those who don't know, are a way to prod the system to get some information about it without disturbing this, without a collapse of the function. And because this event happened, we can now have a back reaction with the information back to the conscious moment, and we can use it in order to survive. And this really comes to the evolutionary mechanism. I'll come in a moment. Before I get there, I'm proposing that two types of conscious experience is sensory experience, which is really what happens when we see things or people touch us, and they really require this retrocausality. And there are reflexive experiences which come more slowly from the brain. And I think there might have an element of that, but it's just not as pronounced as before. So the model of consciousness, the full model, is like this. What we have here, we have from the bottom the input of the body of autonomic input, that's immediate input from the nerves. We have the input from the brain of all the qualias. We have in the past all those projections, what we think is happening in the world. And then when we actually become conscious, we have this retrocausal qualia that allows us to take this insight and bring it into a present moment of consciousness. And why would it give us, why would it evolve, and why are we conscious in the first place? And by the way, there was a guy in this conference, a British philosopher called Nicholas Humphrey, who actually suggested, and I kind of agree with it, that we should change the terminology a bit. And when we say consciousness, we actually use sentience, because I think that's what we really mean by that. And proto-consciousness should really be cognitive consciousness, but it's a numerical thing. So let's look at the picture on the left. Let's look at a bat. A bat is going to have quite a large number of sensory inputs and a much smaller number of cortical neurons which deal with thinking. And if we think about it, the bigger your amount of neurons in your cerebellum, the longer it takes for the processing to occur. So it's going to take longer to build up that potential. So an animal which is just evolving and it's just beginning to have some kind of what they call the sensory associative neurons, which is kind of the cortex neurons, its processing is going to be very, very fast. So there's always going to be, but it's always going to be slower than what comes straight up from the body. So there's a gap between what we feel when someone touches us and how long it takes us to think it through. Now, this gap means that it takes a little time to understand what the hell's going on. Now, if this gap is too long, we're going to die. Because if we walk in the jungle and a tiger jumps on us, and it takes us half a second to work out it's a tiger, by the time we worked it out, he ate us. So there's a minimal amount, I call it the TE, the survival gap, the evolutionary gap, that if an organism takes more than that to process, they're not going to continue surviving. So evolution has two options: either stop growing the nerves, or be able to select for a mechanism that actually has some retrocausality that closes that gap. And in my view, that is the key for the emergence of sentience on Earth and for the development of consciousness. But this is also the why of why qualia take place. So qualias are more complex representations of the outside, and they can take place because we managed to have a longer gap that allows us to process it better. And this is the first time that I've seen at least an evolutionary explanation of how consciousness can somehow interact with this quantum explanation and provide also a reason why it occurs in the first place. And so we have a long evolution. You have this continuum. We have life, which depends how you define it, like whether it's a molecule or something else. Then we have what's called a pro-consciousness. So animals that have a nervous system, but they're going to have what's known as ganglions, which are a collection of cells, but they're not going to have like a brain. And then at a certain stage, when the gray matter starts to grow and the gap gets bigger than this evolutionary gap, the jump occurs and we go into retrocausality, and I think we develop sentience. And I think probably bats are the lowest level animals that have sentience, looking at the amount of neurons that they have. And coming back to the scallop, because I'm sure we're all holding your breath to know whether the scallop is conscious or not. So scallops have a neural structure with 3 ganglions, which means they've got 3 collections of central collections of nerve systems going in. The other thing is scallop, I don't know if you know, but the shell of the scallop is full of little eyes. And those little eyes also combine together for a little bunch of neurons. But actually, just there aren't enough neurons, in my view, to process in a time that's going to give a delay. So I think that scallops are actually not sentient. So they might be cognitively conscious, i.e. they know when to open and close or move, but they don't have sentience in the sense that scallops don't have an internal experience because the system is too close. So I'm feeling much less guilty about killing a scallop. So I guess this is the last slide, and I'm just going to quickly discuss 3 areas, and I'm happy to touch on a 4th one, which is quantum computers. This work took me to places I wasn't expecting, and I'll explain what I mean. When I developed those ideas about the narrow field of consciousness, it started to make me think about meditation experiences where people talk about deep meditation, and you have this state of no mind. And it made me think, actually, consciousness might have no content at all, because it's something that happens at the moment, and we populate it with what we see from our brains. And my current view is that this retrocausal effect is like a key. And when this retrocausality happens, something comes in. And I think that something that comes in is a panpsychic thing. It's a connection to a greater consciousness. And this retrocausality opens the door for that. And that's why sentience is a connection to greater consciousness. And another way for me to think about it, because I've read books like The Secret Life of Trees, that I think plants have some consciousness, but I think it's a group consciousness. I don't think it's individual consciousness. So this retrocausality creates individual consciousness, which is the best metaphor I have is if you think of a black screen with a very strong spotlight behind it, every time that happens, you prick it and light comes in. So there's one source of light, but they come in different places. And I think this is what is consciousness, which is not what I was expecting to find when I started this. And that is similar to some feelings I had and some reports people have. When it comes to artificial intelligence, it is also interesting. If you follow my argument, most of what we think as thinking is the brain, it's not consciousness. And so, yes, I believe that we'll be able to develop computers which are going to be very intelligent, much more intelligent than us. But I don't believe we're going to achieve the phenomenal experiential idea of consciousness within a computer unless we can somehow find a way to completely model the physiological mechanism that creates a back reaction. So I think artificial intelligence is going to be massively intelligent, but I don't think it's going to be conscious the way we understand it, even though it might not be possible to tell the difference. That's the truth. And the last point, as I mentioned about quantum computers, this is just my view on quantum computers. I think quantum computers are a wonderful setting for experiments in the foundation of physics. I think they're many, many years away from doing anything useful besides cryptography, because the algorithms don't seem to be there yet, and the complexity is not there.